Okay, today is November 8, 2011, and last week we took the examination. I want to go over the examination and the correct responses, and then we'll begin the module on how children experience abuse. And you don't have the examination in front of you because it was on paper and I collected them. I'm not going to hand them back out. If you want to know what you got wrong, then email me. You don't have to post in a cyber cafe for that, but email me and I'll tell you which ones you got wrong. And you may realize what you got wrong when you listen to the correct responses. And I don't know that these are in the same order as they were when you took the exam or when I printed them out for you to take on paper. But in any event, question 1 here is, when asked, "Where is the jury?" 5-year-old Amanda said, "In a box on mommy's dresser. She has earrings, rings, and bracelets." This is an example of blank. A blank error, or N blank error, AN. Someone know the response? Many of you got it right. When a child confuses jewelry with jewelry, there was a learning project on this, I think. That's an auditory discrimination error. And you were asked to look it up and research it a bit, and we went over many examples of it. The oath was mistaken for the oats and oak trees and things like that. So that was an auditory discrimination error. Question 2, when it comes to inconsistency among children, deliberate falsehood is not the most likely explanation. Among young children, inconsistency is normal. True or false? True. That's true. Deliberate falsehood is very rare among children, and it certainly doesn't explain typical inconsistency. Kids, for a variety of reasons, can be inconsistent or give us responses that seem unusual or counter to what we expect or are non-responsive. And that's what we've been talking about generally since day one. I mean, the example of jewelry and jury and oath and oak is an example of a linguistic problem or a linguistic explanation for inconsistency or non-responsiveness or unusual responses. It's important that we're on the same page with children. Unfortunately, we have to start out almost from the very beginning of our interview with the assumption that we're not on the same page, because children grow and develop and process the world around them quite differently than we do. So inconsistency is not a result of deliberate falsehood, typically. When a child erroneously reports having experienced an event when it was merely repeatedly suggested to them, it is known as blank. Now, this question, some of you got right. I'd say about a third of you got it right, maybe a little less. I didn't talk about it. It is mentioned in the readings, but it's not mentioned explicitly, so everyone got credit for this. In the online course and in your course as well, you received the same examination in both sections. So whatever you put for this response, you got credit, even if it was bizarre or blank. You got credit. So I gave everyone 1 point for this. And I realized that I really didn't emphasize this before the examination. And in the readings about suggestibility, there is a section that talks about source attribution. The author doesn't mention what I was looking for, source misattribution. And that's when a child confounds or confuses the source of the memory, where they remember this from. Kids can have very vivid memories of events that didn't happen exactly like they remember them, or didn't happen at all, as we saw with the mousetrap study. Remember the mousetrap study? Little Billy got his finger caught in the mousetrap, and it never happened. That would be a dramatic example of source misattribution. Let's deconstruct that trio of words, or pair of words, actually. trio of syllables. Source misattribution. The source of the memory. It's not accurate. The source of the memory is what we're talking about, and misattribution means they're mistaken. It's wrong. The attribution of the memory is wrong. Attribution means where we got it from. Or, attribution is also a synonym in scholarly writing for citation, or where you got that paragraph from, or that quote from, right? When we say, oh, that's a nice quote in your research paper, I need to see the attribution. Where did you get it from? Did you get it from Wikipedia? Or did you get it from some scholarly article? Did you do some original research? What was the source of that? I need attribution, many professors might say to you. Well, in the world of memory, especially in this context, children's memory, we are concerned about source attribution, and we're concerned more particularly about source misattribution. Because sometimes kids and people can have memories that are very real and very vivid, but they didn't experience it. It was suggested to them, or they picked it up in some other way. Now, when I was a kid, my mother and my father gave me many lessons and told me many things I can and can't do, right? You get all kinds of rules from your parents, and that's how we grow and learn and become the people we are. And a couple of things that stand out in my mind. One time my mother told me not to touch this particular plant in the house. And, once she says that, I made it my business to try and touch that plant. But I was in great fear of touching it. I wanted to touch it. I got close to the plant. I looked at it. I kind of waved my hand over it. But I never really touched it because she told me that this plant, if you touched it and then you touched your mouth or your tongue, you would become without voice or speechless or dumb, as they said back then, right? You couldn't speak. It would anesthetize your tongue and you would lose the ability to speak. As I grew up, I later thought about that, and I said, my mother just didn't want me messing with the plant. She made that up. And then I did a little bit more research, and there actually is a plant out there. And I don't know exactly what it is, but if you want to Google it or look it up, maybe I'll do it when I go home today. There actually is a plant that has some, I guess, anesthetic-like properties in the leaves that your tongue might get a little numb or something. You won't become speechless or lose the ability to talk. My mother also told me that when I was a little boy that I took a set of keys that belonged to her and I stuck them in the outlet. And the jolt of electricity was so powerful that the key began to become soft and melted just the slightest bit. And to me, that was the story of when Joey stuck the key in the wall outlet and it melted. And I heard my mother tell that story so many times to friends or people who came over for coffee or whatever, her friends and things, that as I got older, in my mind's eye, I remember sticking the key in the socket and it melting. I don't know if that ever happened or not, but even if it did, I don't have any independent recollection of that. The only memory I have is from listening to my mom tell that story over and over again. So if you ask me to think about the time I stuck the key in the outlet and it melted, if I close my eyes, I remember that. But the source is misattributed. The source is not from remembering it happening. It's from my mother telling that story over and over again. That's an example of source misattribution. And we worry about that in forensic interviewing because if we ask kids questions in a coercive way, in a misleading way, in a repetitive way, there is the potential to shape and distort and, unfortunately, in rare cases, create memories that never happened. Thus, that would be source misattribution. Now, if I asked you this question, you would probably get it right, but I never gave you this part of the lecture. And I think you needed it to really understand this concept. I'll recite the question again. When a child erroneously reports having experienced, in italics, experienced an event, when it was merely suggested to them, it is known as source misattribution. Select the sentence that is in the passive voice and may present difficulty for a child. Gabriel carried the pail into the basement. Anthony and Sam held the door firmly shut. During the assault, Cleo was rubbed by John. Martha's son, David, scratched Lucinda on her back. Now, remember, we talked about agency, we talked about the active and passive voice, and what we concluded was that when kids are acquiring language, and when we read to kids, and when kids are exposed to books and children's stories, what they're used to is that the person who's doing something's at the beginning of the sentence. The agent, the doer, is at the beginning of the sentence, and the thing acted upon, or the object, is at the end of the sentence. And there's usually a verb in between. That would be the active voice. When you flip it around, when you put the object at the beginning and the doer or the agent at the end, that's confusing to kids. And you may get an erroneous response. You may get a statement by them or an answer that doesn't sound right, that's not consistent with what you know already about the case. And it's not because the child is being deliberately deceptive, as I brought up in question 2. It's because we ask the question in the passive voice, and that is beyond the developmental ability of some kids to understand. So we want to speak and question kids in the active voice. Let's go back to those 4 questions, or 4 examples of sentences. Gabriel carried the pail into the basement. Okay, who's doing what? Who's the doer or the agent in that sentence? Gabriel. And he's acting upon the pail, bringing it in the basement. So that would be in the active or the passive voice? Active voice. Now I had dual subjects here just to mix it up a bit, but hasn't changed. Anthony and Sam held the door firmly shut. Who are the agents in this sentence? Anthony and Sam. Are they at the beginning of the sentence? Yes. Is this in the active voice? Yes. During the assault, Cleo was rubbed by John. Okay. Who's doing something in this sentence? Who's the doer or the agent? John. And the object is Cleo. And in this sentence, the object is at the beginning of the sentence, at least in the beginning of the action. And the agent, the doer, is at the end. That would be passive voice. Martha's son David scratched Lucinda on her back. David is scratching Lucinda. Active voice. I saw Randy and Arthur touching each other. He had a big one. The word that creates ambiguity in the preceding sentence is the personal pronoun blank. Do we know who has a big one? No, right? I saw Randy and Arthur touching each other. Okay, that's a concrete recollection. He had a big one. Well, we don't know if it's Randy or Arthur, so that is ambiguous. Thus, the personal pronoun that creates the ambiguity is he. He had a big one. The Sam Stone study demonstrated the suggestibility dynamic of, now to the extent that I didn't give you information about source misattribution, I think the opposite occurred with regard to Sam Stone. I think I beat that one to death, and I would expect that you would have gotten it. And many of you did, some of you didn't. The dynamic that Sam Stone illustrated was what? And we talked about it in context of Margaret Kelly Michaels, in another context. Stereotypical, stereotype induction, stereotyping, all of those work, and that's what it's about. It's about priming a child, in this case, to think a certain way about Sam Stone, that he's clumsy, that he's oafish, that he's goofy, that he soils things and breaks things and all that. That's stereotyping. And that was the main issue in Sam Stone. That was the suggestibility dynamic, and thus the correct response. Most of the research that followed the Kelly Michaels case, predominantly the work of Stephen Ceci and colleagues, involved intrafamilial abuse with older children and provides significant lessons on how to avoid influencing children's recollections. Now, we learned about CC and those folks who studied kids' vulnerability to suggestion. And when we looked at that research, did it involve intrafamilial cases, dads and uncles and stepdads? Did it involve family cases with older kids? No. One of the limitations of that research, one of the things I pointed out, was the lack of ecological validity. And ecological validity is how much the experiment or the research mirrors what really happens in abuse. Now, there are aspects of that research that undermine, I argue, its ecological validity. But more importantly, when someone brings up Sam Stone, the mousetrap study, the clown study was Gail Goodman, these other studies that he was involved in, the Mousetrap 2, these studies all involve preschoolers and little kids. The oldest kids, I think, in any of those studies were 6 or 7. And most of them were 4 or 5. And you saw he had a book and he was turning really fast. You remember the videos we watched. You were little kids. They weren't older kids. Franz Anton Mesmer was famous in the 18th century while in France for curing both adults and children's ailments. When a special commission was created to examine the legitimacy of Mesmer's magnetism ceremonies, they concluded that the patient's responses were the product of what? And that goes way back. That goes back to the lesson that I wasn't here, where you listened to the lecture on YouTube. And it was in your readings as well. I mentioned it in the lecture, and it was in your readings from week 1 about the historical context of suggestibility. And if you remember that reading, this guy Mesmer was running around France just before the time of Napoleon and shortly around the time of the Revolution, and he was waving this wand or this silver staff, and he had flowing robes with moons and stars, and people would go to him that were ill, and he would adjust their animal magnetism, and they would get well, some of them. And they appointed a special commission to study Franz Mesmer, and the conclusion, the correct conclusion, I would agree, was that this was hypnosis, early hypnosis, or suggestion. The power of suggestion, hypnosis would have been a correct response, that he was hypnotizing them. In fact, from his surname, we get a word that is somewhat synonymous with hypnotic. Can someone tell me what the word is in the English language? Mesmerizing, yes, very good. By the age of 5 or 6, nearly all children can provide highly detailed narratives describing the circumstances surrounding an event. Now, that's a true-false question. And before we began the exam, I expressed to you that when you see superlatives or definitives, when you see things like all, ever, always, never, it's probably going to be false. And this thing has multiple superlatives. Nearly all, well, that might give you pause. Nearly all. Highly detailed narratives at 5 or 6? No. That's why we're here, because 5 and 6-year-olds can't give highly detailed narratives about past events. We're learning about how to get that kind of information from kids in this class, or at least we're learning about the research in this area and some of the strategies that you can use in the field. A young child's inability to see the world from another's perspective is known as what? Egocentricity, or cognitive egocentricity, or something using the word egocentric works, because that's the answer. The Margaret Kelly Michaels case was a decision by the New Jersey Supreme Court that introduced the idea that investigative interviews can sometimes produce unreliable testimony. True or false? True. That's what Kelly Michaels was about. Constant correction when a child makes an error of grammar or sentence structure is very helpful in a youngster's language development. And we concluded that that's not the case. That is incorrect. That kids learn visually and in context by absorbing the world around them. It's not simply the words that help them acquire language. It's the words, the context, the behavior of their parents and caregivers. And correcting their grammar is not helpful. And the articles that you read make that point as well. By age 4, children can provide a meaningful explanation of why a person acted a certain way. That question asks you whether a 4-year-old, a preschooler, a pre-preschooler perhaps, a 4-year-old can tell us the motivations of other people. And we made the observation they don't even know their own motivations, much less be able to discern the motivations of the people around them. It is a dicey proposition to ask adults to tell us what some other human's motivation was. Why did Daddy go in the other room? Why did your brother stay in the yard? Lawyers have an objection for questions like that. You don't have to be a lawyer to know what this objection is, because the Hollywood and television love putting these kinds of objections in because they're very concrete. People understand them. If you ask a little child or an adult, why did so-and-so do X, what would the objection be? What's that?
Conjecture.
Conjecture. That's a fancier word than I was thinking of, but it calls for speculation, right? It calls for guesswork, conjecture. So the last thing we want kids to do is be speculating about others' motives. And more importantly, they're not even equipped to speculate. In order to speculate about someone's motives, you have to have experience. You have to have life's experience. You have to have been involved with people who went in the yard or took an umbrella with them or got in the other side of the car or kept their pants on or whatever. Whatever the issue is, why did so-and-so do something? You have to have a little life's experience in order to speculate in this world. So back to the question, by age 4, kids cannot provide a meaningful explanation about why a person acted a certain way. Sexually specific comments, aggressive sexual play with other children, and constant masturbation are all examples of the healthy, natural process of growing up. True or false? I changed the way I presented that question, and you bit. No, it's false. Think about it, though. And that's why it's not a trick question. It's a question that requires that you read it and look at it. Think about it. I think it's actually a good true-false question. And the reason is because masturbation in and of itself, children touching their private parts because it's pleasurable at whatever age, is not necessarily indicative of abuse or some kind of unhealthy sexualization or something wrong with the child. Masturbation can be a normal and a healthy part of growing up. But when there's excessive masturbation, when it's accompanied by sexually specific and explicit comments, there's a problem there, and that's not normal. Constant masturbation's not normal. Aggressive sexual play, there's another buzz phrase. They're all in there. That's not normal. You know, if kids are engaging in sexual play and they're involved in sexual exploration, it's typically not aggressive. It's curious. It's not coercive and violent and aggressive. So the answer would be false. And the next question really, if you got 14, you get 15. Sexual play is a natural and healthy process in children, including toddlers. True. The younger the child, the faster the rate of forgetting. True. Children's meaningful linguistic competence develops by watching TV, reading books, and interaction among their environment, natural ability and experience, or mimicking adults. Which one was it? 3 is correct. An interaction. We learned that. I think I might have used I know I certainly did it on the video lecture. Gave the example of that movie Splash, and where the mermaid was watching TV all day and she learned the English language in that movie with Tom Hanks and Daryl Hannah from the 80s. Or, watching Spanish language television. I could watch it all day for a month. I'm not going to learn Spanish. But if I spend a month in Madrid or in San Juan, I'll probably have a pretty decent command of the language, because I need it to survive. I need it to get out of my house and buy something to eat, right? I need to use it in context. So that's how people learn language.
Isn't there a question about the number 4, mimicking adults, when it's not learning a second language, but learning language from the beginning? That was I picked number 3, but I still felt that there was a pull toward number 4.
Well, think about it. I think the operative word in my question was children's meaningful linguistic competence develops by. And, these kind of questions are always the best answer. And I think I emphasized over and over again that it's context, environment, experience with using language that makes that happen. There's a certain amount of mimicking adults, but that's not how. That's not the most powerful influence on their competence, I would argue. Nor is watching TV, but my son Daniel watches TV all the time, and he learns new words and uses them correctly many times. So it's in the mix. That's part of their life's experience, I imagine, but that's not going to get you there alone. The mousetrap study provided an example of how repeated questioning and suggestions to visualize events, for example, the picture in the head game, could produce a false memory. And the answer to that is yes, true. We watched that. That was what was disturbing about it. The kid had a false memory, and it was repeated questioning. He was told to think about this. Think about the time you got your finger caught in a mousetrap. That's what the video clip showed us. That's what your readings demonstrated as well.
Actually, it wasn't suggesting did you finger it caught, like how you said it. It was did you ever get your finger caught? It was never in the point of leading that the child put their finger in. It's where the repeat and the child gets linked it.
Yes. Thank you for correcting me. And if I make a mistake again, please. No, this is a finding words you'll learn later. You're 100% right. I expressed it more definitively than they said. It wasn't as direct and misleading as I said it. They said, did you ever get your finger caught? In fact, they all started out by saying, did you ever see an alligator or something eating, whatever, blueberries or something like that? Yeah, so it was the impact of those repeated questionings, but they were also told to think about it, too. Yeah. That may not have been evident in the clip, but it's evident in the writings when you read about it, to visualize and think about these events. The type of memory that requires exposure to a cue, a word, a picture, or an object. Now, this was among your readings. I don't believe I talked about it. Many of you got it right, but some of you didn't. And I imagine if you didn't do the readings, you wouldn't get it right unless you just knew it. And the readings describe two main kinds of memory. Recognition memory and recall memory. Recognition memory and recall memory. Now, some of you put recall here, and that means you read it, but you just confused it. Recall memory is just tell me what happened before class. That's just an open-ended question that asks you to basically provide a narrative about a broad subject area. Recognition memory cues you in some way. The soiled teddy bear or the ripped book in the Sam Stone study. When that was presented to the child, that would be tapping into recognition memory, because it's a cue, it's a prompt, it's something that's relevant to the question that's being asked, something from the event that's used to jog someone's memory. we not only use props to jog people's memories, but we use words and questions. So, tell me what you did before class today would be a recall memory question. A recognition memory question would be, tell me what happened when you pulled your car into the parking lot and the cop came. Right? Now I'm giving you some specific information to cue you. I don't know what happened, so it's not suggestive in that sense. Right? I don't know what the cop did. I don't know what you did. I don't know if you got a ticket. I don't know if you didn't get a ticket. I don't know if you're in the right parking space. Certainly gives you information, but I don't know what the outcome was. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what occurred. Now that would be tapping into your recognition memory. I am cueing you through a prompt. The prompt is words or a set of words. Recognition memory. Now recognition memory can be prompted not only by words but also by objects and other things as well. Anything that is relevant to the event that you're presented with later that helps you remember something would be an example of recognition memory. So words, objects, soiled teddy bears, ripped books. What might another example be of something from when it happened that helps jog your memory and tap into recognition memory? I like to think of the term recognition as I recognize that thing from when it happened and it makes me remember better. That's kind of how I remember recognition memory. But what might another example be? What else might help you remember besides an object or a word? A smell, very good. A smell. Any one of your senses, really. A smell might help you remember something and may tap into recollection. I remember the smell of fresh cut grass, and that doesn't make me remember landscaping or my front lawn. It makes me remember football practice. You know, in the summer before you really got into the practice, when you had triple sessions. That was a little bit of trauma for me. The fresh cut grass jogs my memory. It makes me think of football practice. Go ahead.
Okay, so can I challenge what my answer was on there?
I don't know what your answer was.
My answer was sensory memory, because we read about the difference between sensory memory and verbal memory with a lot of different highlighted aspects.
Mm-hmm.
So I wondered if that to me sounded like a sensory memory. You're looking at a visual thing and it jogs a sense that you remember something.
Well, I'll consider your argument and I'll look at it more closely. I tend to think of sensory memory as more narrow, right? See, recognition memory is a kind of memory that can be jogged by any kind of cue. And I put here a word, a picture, an object, right? I think sensory memory is a subset of recognition memory, right? That's one way, you know. But anyway, I'll take a look at that. I mean, it's certainly in the ballpark. I don't know. I'll take a look at it again. Both of them are related to remembering stuff from the past based upon. But I'll think about it. Between 3 and 4 years old, children can relate clock time to their schedule. That's a Jeopardy mistake there, right? Clock time? 3 and 4? False. I think you all got that right. I hope you did. Children older than 11 are typically no more suggestible than adults. That's true. Talked about that. Adolescents may have the language skills of school-age children. If they are, and you had to select the appropriate response, and you could have selected a combination of them. One was born in certain parts of New Hampshire, undereducated, prone to play violent video games, underparented, unattached, developmentally disabled, all of the above, or answers 2, 4, 5, and 6. Okay, let's see what that would be. 2 would be undereducated, 4 would be underparented, 5 would be unattached, and 6 would be developmentally disabled. All right, so the question is, can an adolescent who has all those things, are those the things we studied, are those the things that we looked at in our readings, that might impact the language skills of an adolescent and bring them to the abilities of a school-age child. Perhaps, let's see what the last one is. 3, 5, and 6. Prone to play violent video games. 5 would be unattached, and 6 would be developmentally disabled. Okay, which one is it? C?
The one just before the last
The one just before the last one?
B or C?
Answers 2, 4, 5, and 6? Yeah, the one just before the last one. That's it. Yeah, because the violent video, I don't know if there's any correlation. I made that up, so there's no evidence that violent video games cause kids to regress linguistically or not progress linguistically. 6-year-old Eileen described the perpetrator as really big. She also reported that it was a male. He spoke loudly and he was tall. Based upon this description, the police should be looking for a teenage boy rather, a young man or an adult, and they can rule out any kids under 13. True or false? False. And that's those are words that are comparatives, right? Those are words that we talked about that have no meaning unless they're connected up to something else. All those words are relative. And to a 13-year-old, and we all know it when a little kid says, the person's really old and they're 25. To them that's really old. So those words are really conclusory. You would need more information. You'd need to question that child further. All of those are conclusory. We need to get a sense of what she means by really big, tall, loud. What does loud mean? A little kid could be loud, an older person could be loud. Questions for preschoolers should be blank and blank, not blank and blank, or blank. Concrete and literal. I think you put literal. I think I gave you the credit for that. It's not what I was looking for, but it works. Simple and concrete, not abstract or complex. Very good. The interviewer says to the 6-year-old, "Do you recall what Danny was doing to Carla in the toy room? What is the main linguistic problem with this sentence construction?" The word Danny is ambiguous. The reference to Carla should precede the introduction of Danny. The phrase, "do you recall," is surplusage and adds nothing to the inquiry. It is unnecessary and potentially confusing. The term toy room is not descriptive enough for a 6-year-old. What's one of my pet peeves? DURs. Do you recall? Now, the only one that might have a little traction is the toy room, and I ain't buying it. I think toy room is descriptive enough for a 6-year-old.
What was your word? Surplusage? Surplusage?
Yeah, that's a legal term. It's
Never heard that word.
there are certain words that only exist in court cases, and you may find them with all the dictionaries that are online and all that. You'll find these words now, but back in the day, before the internet, what I mean by back in the day, you might open Webster's and not found surplusage. Yet it's a word that's commonly used in court cases. And it's an effective word in court cases because courts are always interested in what's relevant, what's important, not stuff that is extraneous or extra or unnecessary. So there are a variety of contexts in which courts use the term surplusage. And that's why I tend to be a little redundant with these things, too. I don't expect you to completely understand that, although I may have used that word in the lectures. But it adds nothing to the inquiry. It's unnecessary and potentially confusing. Plus surplusage ought to have brought you to the correct response. Any questions about all that? Okay. Let's take a look at this week's lessons. Oh, by the way, I think around 7:30, we're going to be leaving, I'm going to be leaving at 7:30. I think at 7:30, one of the grad assistants is going to come and ask you to fill out a evaluation of the course and an evaluation of the course. So I have to leave, and I will. But sometimes they do it at the beginning. Have you done any of those this semester? Yeah, so you know what it's about. Once you're done with that, you can go. And at least I've made an appointment for someone to come. I haven't communicated with them in a few days, but I expect they'll be here. So you'll likely get out a little early, and I have to leave at 7:30 unless they don't come. And I'm leaving at 7:30. We'll all leave at 7:30 then. She doesn't come. Okay, what I'd like to do now is begin to introduce the concept of how kids experience abuse, and most particularly sexual abuse. Although we may talk a little bit about physical abuse and emotional abuse, it may come up in the context of this discussion. Now, I know because you're in this program and many of you are members of the child protection and social workers and the like, that you've likely studied this in the past. You may be studying this in this very program right now. I've had students who are in another class talking about some of the things that I'm talking about and we'll talk about in a moment. To the extent that it's redundant, hopefully it becomes a little stickier and you appreciate it more, or are able to recall it better, and for your examinations and tests, and also for your practice as well. And hopefully you can appreciate a little bit of a different perspective that I have and that we have in the context of forensic interviewing. We're not thinking about how kids experience abuse and how trauma impacts kids in order to treat them, in order to make them healthy again, in order to counsel them. We're looking at it in an effort to understand how to interview them, to understand how that trauma, how that abuse impacted their ability to express themselves or the desire to express themselves. So we're interested in how kids experience abuse because their very personal abusive experience can give us great insight into whether they'll talk, what they might say, and how they might say it. So sexual abuse and how kids respond to that kind of trauma can help us understand that kid's perspective, help us understand their coping strategies, and ultimately help us understand how to question them more effectively. It's good to know, before you begin a forensic interview, what kinds of issues may be problematic with this child. So as I've emphasized time and again in this course, we don't interview we don't interview children, we interview a child, right? We don't interview children, we interview a child. And we mentioned that in the linguistic or language discussion. And it's equally important here. We want to appreciate how kids typically experience abuse, and then more importantly, or perhaps equally important, how this kid experienced abuse. So the more we know about how kids generally react to abuse, and the more we know about how this kid experienced the abuse and how they responded to it, how they coped, the better kinds of questions and the better kind of presentation we can make to that child in a forensic interview. So we start off with the typical response of a sexually abused child. And the landmark article on this issue was written by Dr. Summit in 1983, and it's called The Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome. Roland Summit was a a doctor out in California at UCLA. He was affiliated with UCLA, and he was concerned about his colleagues and concerned about kids and concerned about how psychology and psychiatry was responding to the problem of child sexual abuse and intrafamilial abuse. And he felt that there were, and he was correct, he felt that there were clinicians and professionals that really didn't understand how kids cope and process abuse. He really wrote this article not for lawyers and prosecutors and judges and forensic interviewers and the like. He wrote it for his colleagues in the field, so that they could better understand how kids experience abuse and they could treat their kids and not draw erroneous conclusions. I mean, even to this day, there are psychologists and mental health professionals who may be skeptical of kids or who may draw erroneous or wrong conclusions about kids, about their veracity, about the breadth of the abuse, because of their misunderstanding of how kids experience abuse. They may draw negative conclusions because they didn't tell right away, or they told something different in the beginning and something more detailed later on. Not only do these misconceptions impair judges and lawyers and interviewers and social workers from making mistakes in their interviews of kids and in their professional response to kids who may have been abused, but it also affects psychologists and clinicians to this day. Some of them. We're way beyond in the field of mental health professionals who treat kids than we were in 1983 when Summit wrote this. And you have the article among your readings. You will notice that that article was written primarily from the perspective of father-daughter incest. Although there are lessons for all kinds of situations that are different from father-daughter incest. I think that it's generally accepted now that the model that Dr. Summit proposed is relevant wherever you have someone who's in a position of authority over a child, where you have a child who's in a subordinate position without many options, and they're sexually abused by that person. It doesn't necessarily have to be a father-daughter. It could be a father-son. It could be a teacher-student. It could be a priest-child. It could be a jail guard and a girl at the detention center. Now, it isn't a perfect fit, the article, for all those situations, but many of the same dynamics are in play. Because at its core, the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome is about a kid who is powerless, who has few or no options, and is subordinate to the molester and has to do what they say. So when you have a grown-up who has power and control over you, and there's no options for you, you're in a situation that's similar to Summit's father-daughter model. And your coping strategies may be very similar. So to revisit this, if you've seen this before, Summit's piece suggested that there are 5, what he calls categories of the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. Secrecy, helplessness, entrapment and accommodation, delayed or unconvincing disclosure, and retraction. One way to remember this is SHEDR, S-H-E-D-R. It's just a mnemonic. secrecy, helplessness, entrapment/accommodation, delayed/unconvincing disclosure, and retraction. Those are the 5 categories that Summit observed about the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. Now, secrecy and helplessness are what Summit called preconditions. Preconditions. And the reason he called them preconditions is because they are foundational. They are critical to understanding the rest. Without the first 2, there can be no molest, or there can be no successful molest. Secrecy and helplessness. And they are the defining aspects of the syndrome. Secrecy. Well, in incest or a jail guard or any of these other situations, but let's focus on intrafamilial incest, father-daughter, as Summit did. The molester acts in secret. It can't be any other way. You cannot molest a child in someone else's presence and get away with it. Unless apparently you are on staff at Penn State University.
Warren Jeffs.
Right. Well, he controlled a great amount of people, I guess. But so you need secrecy as a precondition. Child molestation happens in secret. It happens when the child's alone with the offender. The offender sometimes goes to great pains to maintain the secret. And although many people, in thinking about the secrecy category, the secrecy precondition of Dr. Summit's child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, although many people think about that in terms of the offender scaring the child silent, or the offender directly threatening the child. If you tell, I'm going to beat you up. If you tell, I'm going to hurt you. If you tell, I'm going to hurt your dog. If you tell, these things are going to happen. These horrible things are going to happen to you. I'm going to do these things to you. Or, and this is a direct threat too, if you tell, they'll put you in a foster home. No one will believe you. If you tell, Mommy will throw me out of the house and no one will pay the bills. If you tell, it doesn't matter what the horrible outcome is that the molester threatens the child with. They're nearly all equally potent. In fact, there is some research, and Professor CSAAS, our friend who likes to show us how kids can be manipulated, if you ask them bad questions over and over again, you can create false memories. Professor CSAAS argues, and there's some appeal to this, is that direct threats of violence, I'm going to kill you, or I'm going to kill Mom, are more rare than we think and not that effective, because those kinds of direct threats may lead to disclosure. When the outcome is so terrible, a kid might tell somebody. Perhaps to protect Mommy and to protect themselves. But, it has some appeal, that kind of thing. But the point is that that's one kind of threat. But an equally powerful threat are the others. This is going to happen to Mom. This is going to happen to your siblings. You're going to wind up in a foster home. No one will believe you. I won't be able to pay the bills anymore. They're going to take our home away. All of those are threats. And powerful threats. Very potent. And very real. And some of them are true. Those things may happen. And you'll see how this, unfortunately, compounds itself in a moment when those threats are made. So those kinds of things are very powerful at maintaining secrecy. Those kinds of threats are one way that secrecy is maintained. They're one way that secrecy is communicated, right? I mean, that's obvious and very direct. But more often than not, the kids don't need to be told directly. They appreciate and understand that this is a secret and no one should be told, even when you don't have direct statements like that. They get the message quite clearly when dad shuts the door and pulls the shades down, and when the child makes a moan or a noise or cries out just a little bit and they go, shh, and their eyes widen and their neck bulges a moment or two. They don't need to say anything. The meta messages, and there are many, make it clear to the child that no one can know, you can tell no one, or bad things will happen. And I suggest to you, from my experience in this field, that those kinds of meta messages may even be more common than the direct messages. However the message is communicated, kids get the idea this can't be told to anyone. So the secrecy is cemented by direct threats, meta messages. And when I say meta messages, I mean indirect messages. Messages that are obvious. You pull the shades down, you shh, you tiptoe. When the kid brings up something at the dinner table that might be relevant to what happened the night before, father's eyebrows arch. Right? The subtle and indirect messages, those kind of meta messages, they can cement silence, no doubt about it. But there's also another force at play here, and that is this sense of responsibility, of complicity that some kids have. So it becomes a more powerful secret. It becomes a secret that is highly unlikely to ever be breached. When you have the lethal combination of threats, indirect or direct, or meta messages, and the child feeling that somehow they're complicit. You know what I mean by complicit? That they think they wanted it or liked it or they were involved. That they feel guilt about it or shame, or that they could have done something differently. So now the shame that they feel, so now the sense of complicity that somehow they brought it upon themselves, or somehow they enjoyed it, or somehow they should have told the moment it started to happen.
So both secrecy and helplessness have to be present. Those are the preconditions that have to be present.
Right, I'm going to get to helplessness, but yeah, that's right. But what I'm suggesting here, though, is that this secrecy is very potent and so powerful, not only because the guy threatens them or they get these messages, but because they don't want to tell because they don't want to get in trouble. Or they don't want to be shamed, or they don't want to feel disgusting, or they can't let this out. Because they're blameworthy. They're somehow responsible. So if you got a guy, if all these messages surround the child, and then you have direct threats or indirect threats, and then the kid feels shame or that they're responsible or they're complicit for their own abuse, how could they tell? Why would they tell? They made it happen. Now, none of that's true, but this is the perception of some of these kids, right? So that shame and guilt ensures that no one will know, and the secret shall be maintained. We know from the research that non-disclosure rates are significant. For women, it goes from anywhere from 33 to 92%. For men, from 42 to 85%. Kids don't tell. The secret is maintained. Large majorities of sexual assaults on adolescents and kids, especially in intrafamilial contexts, go unreported. The other precondition, though, as was just suggested, is that helplessness. This is the other part of the recipe. If it's not a secret, it's going to be found out. If it's found out, someone will stop it. Because the vast majority, the world is a good place. Despite these terrible things we study and learn about, the world's a good place. There are good people there. And if people find out, there will be someone who stops it. So you need secrecy. But the other thing you need is helplessness. Because if the child or if the victim wasn't helpless, but powerful and able and competent, and could do something to stop it, they would. And there would be no abuse. That's why it's a precondition. If the class of victims that we're talking about in child molestation cases were powerful and not helpless, if they could defend themselves and make it stop, there would be no child abuse, child sexual abuse. On the other hand, if you have a helpless victim and they secret molest, the die has been cast and molestation can happen. So these are preconditions. The combination of a secret act with a helpless victim sets up the child sexual abuse. Children are subordinate to older people. They're those people in authority. They have no one they can go to. They're helpless because these are their parents and their caregivers, right? So this helplessness is a precondition. And why do we see it? How does it manifest itself? It manifests itself because kids are subordinate to their caregivers. They have to listen to their dads and moms and to their parents and to their aunts and grandmas. Whoever's caring for them tells them what to do. Now, it's been some time since we were all children, but if you think about it, if you have children or you have nieces or nephews and you think about the way their daily lives are organized, they're organized around the rules of their parents. We tell them what they can do, whether they can go out after school, whether they can have a snack, what to wear, what not to wear, what to eat, what not to eat, what color socks to put on, what time they have to go to bed, what shows they can watch. Their entire lives are defined by their caregivers. And they blindly, as kids do, listen to their caregivers. They don't challenge them. That's what we do. We listen to our dads and moms. They may do it reluctantly in certain cases and contexts, but they certainly, in the vast majority of cases, don't challenge that authority. They do what they're told, because that's what kids do. And when the perpetrator is that person, when the perpetrator is the caregiver, then there's a problem. Then you're truly helpless. Because when you have a problem, when you need help, when you want to stop something bad from happening, kids go to their caregivers. The person who's supposed to help them is their caregiver. The person who's supposed to intervene on their behalf is their caregiver. So what happens here from these two preconditions is you have a child who's trapped. They can't go to their caregiver because the caregiver is the one who's being exploitive. They are truly trapped. They have nowhere to go and no place to hide. The very person who by God or nurture or nature has been put on this planet to intervene on their behalf and act in their interests doesn't do that. They do the opposite. They exploit and take advantage of them. So if they wanted to complain, they couldn't. The very person they're supposed to complain to is the molester. So they are trapped and they have no way out and no options. And when you have no options, you got to survive. One thing about humans and kids is they're resilient and they figure out ways to cope, to make it feel good inside, to get through the day. And that's what accommodation is. It's just a way of coping. It's a way of dealing with something you have no control over. So how do you cope? What are some of the ways that kids cope? What are some of the ways kids deal with something that they have no power to change?
Go somewhere else. Mentally. Yeah.
Dissociation's one way. They go somewhere else mentally, it's suggested. Very good, that's true. Kids may do that as it's about to happen or when it's happening. They don't feel it. Some describe it as almost coming out of their body and watching themselves from another dimension. That is a psychological coping strategy. It's not me. It's not me that's being touched. It's someone else. So they kind of look at their own bodies and they kind of numb themselves mentally. And it works. The problem is, we all do that. We all cope by not thinking about bad things and thinking about positive things. I lost my parents, and I don't want to think about how my mom died and how horrible that was. I think about other things. I try to not focus on that. If there's something that reminds me of that or some issue that arises, but it happens infrequently. When this happens day after day, when you have to leave your body, when you have to numb yourself, when you have to use your mind as a coping strategy day after day, week after week, as you grow older, you're going to have mental health problems, and that's part of the residual of child molestation. The human body and the mind and the psychology of human existence gives us an escape route. Dissociation is a very powerful and healthy way to cope with certain things, but not every day, all day. No one's built for that. So one way we do that, one way kids do that, is by dissociating. What are some other things that kids might do to deal with it, to try to cope?
The article said play possum.
Yeah, play possum. And that's a couple of things are happening here. One, it might be part of dissociation where they're not really there. But the other thing is maybe he'll go away. Maybe he'll stop. Maybe if I'm not a partner to this. Maybe if I'm not a partner to this, he won't like it and he'll stop. And so there are a few things that work there when kids play possum and act like they're sleeping or act like they're not there. And that's a coping strategy, no doubt about it. Other things they do is, as kids get older, they stay in school later. Some kids become overachievers. Not all of these kids wind up having problems in school and running away and cutting themselves and having identity disorders, and although those things happen as well. But some of them stay in school a lot. They join every group there is. Why? Because they don't want to go home. And they want to get out of the house early and they want to come home late. That's one way to deal with it, right? If you ain't there, you can't be molested. So that's one way to cope. And some kids do that. Some kids wear baggy clothes. Some kids change the way they appear. Some kids take no pride at all in their appearance. What do you think they're doing there?
Showers, funky, smelly.
They don't shower, they don't take care of themselves, or they dress in baggy clothes, or they dress gender neutral.
Make themselves unattractive.
Yeah, in their mind they're making themselves sexually unattractive, and then maybe it'll stop. Or it'll go away. Or it won't happen again.
I think they would get eating disorders too, kids. Maybe.
Well, eating disorders and the cutting behaviors and those kinds of self-injurious behaviors. I'm sorry, go ahead. Bedwetting, that kind of regression happens too. But some of the things they do deliberately to try to cope include those kinds of self-injurious behaviors. And it helps them deal with it. But none of it's healthy. None of it helps in the long term. We've had kids who went in the garage and tried to nail their door shut. I mean, that's one way to do it, a very practical way, And as a prosecutor, I tell the detectives and I tell child protection workers, if you see that, take a picture of it. I want to see where the nails in the wall are because they're very compelling images.
I have a question about those kinds of behaviors, though. It doesn't sound like those are accommodating. Those sound like they are sort of anti-accommodating. Like, accommodation to me seems like a child who acquiesces and lets it happen because she's afraid of what the consequences will be if she doesn't acquiesce. These kinds of things like nailing your door shut or staying in school late, those seem like fighting against accommodating.
Well, they're all under the banner of, how they deal with the abuse and how the children want to reduce its impact. Avoid it and reduce its impact. And, I think that the general dictionary sense of the word accommodating may not capture all that, because accommodating seems like they go along with it. But we're talking about coping, really, is probably the better word, and accommodating psychologically. Surviving and living with it, rather than die. There has to be a way that they deal and live with it, and they accommodate psychologically, I guess, and they accommodate physically. They accommodate to the environment that they're in. They learn to live. If you're a prisoner of war and you're living in a 4x4 cell made out of bamboo, and you learn to live in there and survive, and you accommodate to your surroundings, and that's physical. They accommodate physically and psychologically, and the cutting and the bulimia and the eating disorders and the like. Strangely enough, it makes them feel better and makes them able to get through the day and exist one more day in a distorted way. Go ahead.
I just want to say about the accommodation.
Mm-hmm.
It also happens when it's not the child. I don't think the child is trying to. It's more like I'm being abused, they say, by dad. Mom doesn't believe me. Brother knows what's going on. Once the child knows, more than one person knows what's going on and nothing's being done, that's when I think accommodation comes into play.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's what I'm kind of
Yes. They're in a position within the family where they don't have really many options, and when you don't have any options, you got to figure out a way to exist and to deal with it. From pulling the covers over your head to playing possum to engaging in unusual behaviors to deal with the psychological impact of it.
Is this similar to Stockholm?
Well, the Stockholm Syndrome was, a very specific psychological phenomena that was described in that kidnapping scenario, I think at a bank in Sweden. But there are elements of it that are similar. I had a case that I prosecuted where a lot of the victim's behavior seemed more like that, at least in parts, like the Stockholm Syndrome, than Summit's model. But that was many years of brutal molestation. And there were some aspects of it where the victim identified with her molester and became almost a partner with him in her own victimization. And that's part of that Stockholm Syndrome. And I'm no expert on that, but they began to identify, they began to protect the persons who captured them, and there were some odd psychological things that happened. And when they were able to get away, they didn't get away.
Is that seen more in domestic violence cases where there's severe DV, where the other parent cannot leave, and then the child, in a sense, assumes the real role of absorbing the abuse?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't have a lot of knowledge about the distorted roles of families and kids taking over in a domestic violence situation, but
is it similar in the sense of the sexual abuse when there is multiple children? Because I think I was reading the child's statement for the project and how she spoke about her other siblings.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then I just read the beginning portion. It seemed like she was taking bear of the abuse in a sense to avoid them getting it?
Yeah, well, that's a common phenomenon you see. You're talking about the Jane Doe statement? Yeah. No, that's a common phenomenon where kids, and that's part of Summit's article too, where he talks about the child becomes the martyr for the family, and they maintain the secret in part because they want to protect the siblings, they want to protect the mother, they want to keep the family together, they don't want the family to fall apart. There's more than a fair amount of overlap between the dynamics of spousal abuse. It's all under the banner of family violence, too, and in some ways the battered spouse is trapped and unable to get out, and the dynamics are different, though, in the sense that they are, in fact, out. That's where it kind of feels like the Stockholm Syndrome a little bit. They don't think they can get away, and they don't think they have any options, when, from the perspective of an observer, they seem to have a lot of options. But there's another syndrome called battered woman syndrome that helps explain those kind of dynamics and those kind of behaviors, which are different in part from how a kid is, because the kid has far less options, and of course the relationships are different. Something else. Go ahead, Frank.
I wanted to ask you a question.
Yeah.
You directly. I don't understand how, say, a child's being abused when they're little. Now, this same child grows up, now she's 18, 19, let's say, and she sees the abuser occasionally. How is it possible that this person can still say, hey, hi, or have a casual conversation, knowing that happened in the past?
Well, the question was, when a child abuse victim grows up and the abuse has stopped for some time now, they're still friendly or still have, a relationship with the offender. And it's common, and I'm sure you've seen it in your practice. And there are a lot of factors at work there. I've had a number of cases involving survivors, adult. Jane Doe's one. I tried another one. It was a 2-month trial involving another family like Jane Doe. These were women in their 30s and 20s who we were able to prosecute despite the statute of limitations. And by all appearances, they maintained a normal relationship with their abuser. There are a lot of different psychological things that drive that kind of behavior. And of course, everybody's different. But part of it is, for the same reason they maintained the secret when they were younger, they don't want anybody to find out now. They think it would be devastating to the family. They don't want their siblings to know. They think mom wouldn't be able to deal with it. They think no one will believe them. Too much time has passed. They still think they're responsible for it. And the other thing is, very often, not always, but very often, in most cases, they don't hate dad or dislike him. They love him. And a lot of these guys do very positive things and do other acts of great parenting. They can be very good parents. And that kind of conflict runs through their brains as well, and families are families. Just because you turned 18, that doesn't mean you're not still a daughter, and you don't still worry about these things. And I was just listening, I started listening to audiobooks, and I'm listening to the guitarist for the Rolling Stones, Keith Richards, wrote an autobiography, and he's in his 60s now. And he talks about it, and you hear it, I'm sure in your families, and you've heard this before, but he talks about how a disapproving glance from his father, and I think his father may have passed away, I'm not sure, but he's talking about at the height of the Rolling Stones' fame, a disapproving glance from his father upset him. And he wanted to please his father, and even though he didn't get that kind of validation at times, and to that day he gets a shudder up his spine, when his father gives him a certain look. And his father was very passive aggressive like that, according to Keith Richards in his biography. So what I'm suggesting is, even though they're 18 and 19, they're still sons or daughters. Some of the very same powerful psychological forces endure. And just reaching the age of majority doesn't change that. Now, they're smarter, they have access to more things, they have options now. They appear to have options. They have physical options, but they may not have psychological options. In their mind, they can't tell. For many of the same reasons that when they were a kid. Mom would fall apart. No one would believe me. I'm to blame. I should have stopped it. And those kinds of things. And again, everyone's different. So that's one way that I think that explains that. So when kids do tell, though, we were looking at entrapment and accommodation. So they're stuck. They got nowhere to go. But there are disclosures. We do uncover these cases. So sometimes we uncover them accidentally. Right? Somebody finds the kid's diary, or the guy gets caught once in a blue moon, or the kid tells a friend or a boyfriend, and that boyfriend calls the guidance counselor in, and the word gets out. Or sometimes the kid tells on their own. And remember I said earlier that when you're a little kid, your parents tell you what to do, what to wear, how to dress, what to eat, what to do. And they don't challenge us. When do they start challenging us? When do they start challenging parents? Teenage years. When? 55? 30? At 5? Well, your kid, yeah, well. Teenagers are rebellious. They tend to begin to challenge their parents and challenge authority and begin to develop a sense of autonomy. And that's when you do get a deliberate disclosure, more often than not it happens in the teen years. When you do, they don't all tell. Many don't tell. But when they do tell, purposefully, never mind being discovered, they told a boyfriend, when they do go to someone to tell because they want something done, or they want someone to know, they want this secret exposed, it happens in those teen years. Unfortunately, the context in which it happens isn't always the best, and Summit makes that observation. So while they do tell in the teens, they don't think about it and lay in bed and go, now's the time to tell. I thought about the pros and cons. I think mom is strong enough to survive now, and I think dad should be punished. That doesn't happen. More often than not, there's a blowout. They can't go out, or their father's ranking on them for going out with this particular boy, or their mother doesn't like the clothes that they're wearing, or they're dressing too provocatively, or they're smoking weed, or they're coming home at 3 a.m, or giving mom the finger and all that, and then mom says, I'm going to tell your father, and she says, go ahead and tell him. Your father, he's a piece of shit. Your father's a good man. Don't you talk about him like that. And then the kid goes, yeah, he's a good man. I'll tell you what kind of man he is. And the words fly across the room, and the cursing and the anger and the blow up. And guess what? That's not the most credible context in which a kid's going to make a disclosure of molestation.
That's kind of like what happened in Texas. Am I saying that right? Where the girl put her abuse on YouTube, but she put it as the result of a fight she had with the judge that abused her.
Yeah. That was disgusting. Did you see that?
I didn't see the video. I read about the case, and but I didn't do a lot of reading about it. I read a couple of AP squibs and all that, so I got the general idea. Her father was a Superior Court judge in Texas. She's a little girl. She's now an adult now, and he's still apparently, like I said, she's still a daughter. Apparently, he's helping her with her apartment and her car. She's a single mom, I guess. So he's kind of helping her financially still and paying for her car bill, and then he was going to cut her loose because, and there, I guess, without knowing a heck of a lot about it, to the extent that there's some similarities in that, he's not going to help her out anymore, and he's going to punish her. It sounded like he was like, well, if you're not going to do X, I'm not paying for your car anymore because I'm in control. Oh yeah, you think you're in control? I'm in control now, right? And this couldn't happen too long ago because it's in the era where she just hit a button on her PC and the webcam and the camera picked it up, apparently. I didn't see it. You saw the video? What is he hitting her with? The belt? The
Bell.
She was 16, I think she's like 19.
She's 16. She's
Okay, so it wasn't that long ago. So she was a
It was
teenager.
like 5, 6, 7 years ago, yeah.
So she wasn't even a little kid. So he beat her like she was a peer, like another adult. But she couldn't defend herself.
What? She has like very slight cerebral palsy, yeah, but still.
But the mom was also there telling her to be still. And
Take
oh,
it
God,
here
the mother
too.
was
Take it
awful.
like a woman, that's what she
That's
said.
the part of the specific, the cerebral palsy that she had, is that those kids tend to like more of like technology and stuff. And part of the reason why she got hit was because she downloaded illegal music or games or something, but that was kind of part of her condition at the same time.
Well, yeah, I don't know how much of an affinity her disability created for technology or whatever, but hundreds of thousands of teenagers download music on the web. So she's doing what all teenagers do. Yeah, well, he's a judge, and he's he's a stern disciplinarian father, and if you talk to the Recording Industry Association of America, it's stealing, and it is stealing. But look, it's a teenager. It's a different kind of stealing. Qualitatively, it's quite different than breaking a jewelry store window and taking a Rolex watch. Okay, and I agree with that. And even if she did that, the remedy isn't to beat her like some horse in the 12th in the 1800s. She's a 16-year-old girl. So obviously, what he did was, from what I hear, it's brutal. It's bad parenting. What I find interesting, though, is if this happened, and it had happened somewhat recently, although file sharing is 10 years old now, downloading music illegally is 10 or 11 years old now. So she was 16 and she's 19 now, and the cop said, well, it's too old to I thought it happened when she was 8 or 9 or something. Too old to prosecute. That is a cop-out. That is an outrage.
No, she's 21.
23, but they,
Oh, 23. Okay, so that makes it 8 years ago. 16 and what is 23? 7 years? 7, 6, 13, yeah. 7 years ago. Well,
but it's in a state that allows teachers to adults do this, so it was in Texas.
well, I don't know what the rules are in Texas. Some of the most well-known and passionate child advocates come from Texas. Some of my colleagues that I work with who are great child advocates are from Texas, and Texas has one of the most sophisticated networks of child advocacy centers in the world, and some very sophisticated law enforcement and police agencies. So I can't think they're that backward there. Now within the educational system, they may still allow. You're saying they still allow you to strike a kid?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, they also are Texas, and they're conservative in their politics.
They were saying that the police said that this was not a case of child abuse, that this was a case of parental, corporal punishment that was allowable under the law.
Well, I didn't see the video, and even in Texas, I need to look more at this, and I'll get back to you on my feelings. But if he was beating her with a belt while she was defenseless,
And swearing at her, and it was awful.
yeah, that's corporal punishment, but it's not reasonable corporal punishment.
Right.
That's assault.
It's not excessive.
That's aggravated assault. And I got to imagine, even in Texas, in New Jersey, corporal punishment's protected, and we talk about that in Children in Justice. Corporal punishment's permissible, but that's not what you're describing to me. And I need to watch it if it's on a video. But what you're describing to me is I would charge and I'd convict successfully. I imagine a jury would not be moved by the defense that he was just being a parent.
But here's the question, because I had this argument with the professional argument. With corporal punishment, because the rule in, I guess, us, depending on if there's physical harm left to the child, say bruise, mark, or anything else, injury, in a sense, it may not fall under the category of excessive corporal punishment. Because I even had this discussion with a superior, where it was arguing that the child got a black eye, but her eye wasn't drooping, so that wasn't excessive corporal punishment. So we had to reverse the findings. I don't understand why, but because of unfortunately our manuals or guidelines, certain people's interpretations vary. So if it's not you're not a member, you don't have an open sore, it may not be excessive.
Yeah, look, I understand what you're saying. There's case law out there. What happened was there's been a couple of appellate division rulings in New Jersey where the division found corporal punishment and it was reversed in the appellate division. And there's the slap in the face case.
That's the recent one, right?
Yeah, the slap in the face case is relatively recent. There's a couple other ones. And it's unfortunate, but all the workers like you want is some clear guidelines. And you don't have that, and it doesn't feel like you're ever going to have it. But we talk about that in Children in Justice. There's a lot of things you need to look at. And to me, the presence or absence of bruising, while relevant to the court, they mention that in some of these cases, is just one of many factors you look at.
What's on her age? Again, factor will,
Developmental issues,
you know, her
medical
disability, if that, you know, because she does cerebral, there was an issue with that.
stress level.
What was the contributing factor to what had occurred? Was there prior history of abuse?
Yeah, we're going to look at all that. I'm not going to talk too much about that here, but
Yeah.
we'll look at all that in Children in Justice if you take that course. But yeah, there's a lot of things in play to evaluate whether a parent went overboard or not. And you know, the slap in the face case, a judge might say, and they may have said it in that case, well, the slap and this and that, and there really was no injury. Injury can be relevant because we're looking at how severe the slap was, right? So if there is injury and it's severe, I don't know, maybe her cornea got scratched and her face has got hematomas on it or broken, whatever. That would, on the one hand, it could tell us how severe it was, but the absence of injury doesn't tell us it wasn't severe. You know, it could be. And the single slap in the face, I think that case was about. There were a lot of factors there, and I think the plaintiffs in that case, the defendants in that case, were professionals. I think it might even have been a doctor. So you know, you do the math on some of these cases. But we'll talk more about that. But and you don't get injuries from belittling and terrorizing someone either. How do you? The injuries are in your psyche and in your emotions. So injuries is a red herring. It's not marginally relevant. It has limited relevance, is what I would argue to anyone who wants to argue about it. But I need to look at this video. It'd be interesting. And I'm also interested in why the Texas authorities didn't charge. Because even where corporal punishment is okay, as it is in New Jersey. Well, they didn't say that, though. They didn't say. And let me tell you, Texas has some very good statute of limitations, as I recall. And I'll have to look closely. Maybe it expired. That'd be the easy way. But they didn't say that. They said, well, it's kind of old. It's too old. The kid's older now. Statute of limitations is real easy to say. Cops love saying it because they can wipe their hands from it, you know? Oh, we'd love to do something about this, but statute of limitations. Here, their behavior is being scrutinized because it's a judge. That's the other thing about is this thing fair? So anyway, we'll talk more about that when it becomes relevant. So when the kid tells, that's where we were. It sometimes happens in this very highly volatile context, and it doesn't get a lot of credibility. It's obviously delayed almost by definition, right? It went on for a while. The kid was trapped. There was no one to tell, nowhere to go. So they endure it, and then they finally do tell, and it doesn't come out in a very convincing way. And it comes out in pieces, in a fragmented way, and that's used against them as well. The triggers for disclosure include family conflict. Somebody discovers it, a third party. Maybe there's some outreach education. Someone comes to the school. Sometimes they want to protect their younger siblings. So there are a variety of reasons that kids do tell when they're teens or even younger. Or they have a sense of autonomy now, and they're someone who has more options. Hi, come on in.
Hello.
Hi.
Good to see your help.
Anyway, as I predicted, we're going to end at around 7:30, and it's 7:30-ish.
Were you talking about the retraction?
Well, yeah. Have a seat just for 1 second, and then I'm going to end class early, and you have to distribute this
Yeah.
evaluation, right? Yeah, just to wrap things up, the last part of Summit's article is a recantation or retraction. And in that chaotic aftermath of disclosure, a lot of things happen. Some of them are the very things that the offender predicted would happen. And that's why I said these things are potent, but they become even more potent when there is a disclosure. Remember, he said no one would believe you, and you'd go to a foster home, and mom would fall apart, and we may lose the house. Well, in that chaotic aftermath, I could go to jail. Your brothers and sisters won't have a daddy. When there is a disclosure, the kid is not ready for this. They told, not because they want the cops to come and a prosecutor to come in their lives and a social worker to visit them. They told because they were angry, because they wanted to get back at dad, or they were pissed at mom, or because someone discovered it, or they just wanted it to stop, or they felt bad about their siblings possibly being molested. All of those reasons have nothing to do with getting the cops involved and the government and dad being arrested and prosecuted. When that happens, there's a tremendous burden on the kid. I mean, it is incalculable the impact that this has upon a child once they tell. To call it chaotic is a bit of an understatement, right? Some, if not in some cases, all of those things happen. Dad does get locked up. The siblings start calling her names, blaming her, calling her a liar. Mom begins to fall apart. They can't pay the bills. They got to put up a lot of money for bail. Maybe they shut off the electricity. They got to get emergency help from social services or from welfare. People at school start looking at them differently. The neighbors find out. They become declared a liar. The word gets around through whispers in the community. It is perhaps the worst thing that can happen to somebody who's still alive. You know, it is unimaginable how that kid feels about what happened. And what do? And it's anywhere between 5% to 20% of the cases or more. They try to reverse it. It's far easier to just say I made it up and lied than to endure what's going to happen to them day after day for the next 3 or 4 years. It's far easier to lie and say I made it all up than to continue in this chaotic aftermath. So they do that, some of them. There is one thing that makes this unlikely. There's one thing that prevents recantations or minimizes the potential, and that is having someone who believes you. Having a grown-up care about you and believe you is the best antidote for retraction or recantation. And it doesn't happen in all the cases. Some kids go, I want to drop the charges, and they don't get dropped. Or he really didn't do it that badly, or it only happened once. They don't want to lie completely, but that doesn't work either. But when a kid has a supportive grown-up or an aunt or somebody who believes in them, you don't get very many recantations. Unfortunately, all the stars and all the family members and all the people in their lives line up against them, and then they're stuck. And so some of them take it all back, and they want to put the family back together again. And that's retraction. That's recantation, and it's part of the syndrome. It is the last stage of the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. Among those kids, when there is a supportive person who intervenes, let's say it's 15%. The numbers are all over the place, between 4% and 22%. Let's say 15% of kids that recant. If child protection does the right thing and law enforcement does the right thing and the teachers do the right thing and somebody believes in them and supports them, tells them it's going to be okay and it's not your fault and we're here for you, over 90% of them drop the recantation and affirm. So we'll talk more about that next week, okay? So that's what we'll wrap up. And I'll post that printable PowerPoint this evening, okay, if you want it, for this whole lecture. And we still have a ways to go.